My whole life, I was told I was just like my dad. You have his smile, his talent, his heart, my mother said. But when I took a DNA test for fun, the results made me drop my phone. At Thanksgiving dinner, I placed the paperwork on the table and said, "So, Mom. Want to explain this?" My aunt let out a choked gasp. My uncle turned away. My grandfather smashed his glass against the wall and roared, "You should have burned that test." My mother burst into tears and whispered, "I never wanted you to know, I had always believed I was my father's son. I grew up hearing about how much I looked like him, how I walked like him, how I even had his laugh." My mother would tell stories about how talented he was, how much he loved me, how proud he would have been if he were still alive. My father had died in a car accident when I was just a baby, and I never had the chance to know him. But I carried him with me, or so I thought. It started as something harmless. A DNA test. I had gotten one of those ancestry kits during a Black Friday sale, just something fun to do. I was curious about my heritage, maybe hoping to see if there were any distant relatives I didn't know about. My mom's side was Irish and Polish, my dad's side was mostly German, or so I was told. I spit into the little tube, mailed it off, and forgot about it. When the results came in, I wasn't prepared. There was no German in me. None. Half my DNA was completely untraceable to anything my father's side was supposed to be. Instead, I saw a completely different background, Italian, Greek, things I was never told about. But the real gut punch? The section that said biological relatives. I expected to see some distant cousins, maybe a relative from my mom's side. Instead, I saw a name I didn't recognize listed as parent. Not my father. Someone else. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands went numb. This had to be a mistake. I refreshed the page. I logged out and logged back in. The name didn't change. My father wasn't my father. I was shaking when I called the testing company. Some part of me was still clinging to the idea that this was a mix-up, a clerical error, that somehow my results had been swapped with someone else's. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. The results were accurate. There was no mistake. I didn't sleep that night. My whole life, I had believed a lie. And the worst part? I had no idea who the man listed as my biological father was. I had never heard his name before. I did what any normal person would do, I started digging. A quick search led me to his social media. He was real. Alive. A man with the same eyes as me, the same crooked smile. He had kids. A family. A whole life I was never a part of. My stomach turned as I scrolled through photos of this complete stranger who shared my DNA. I felt sick. That Thanksgiving, I walked into my mother's house with the printed results in my hands. My whole family was there, my aunt, my uncle, my grandfather, my cousins. The dining table was set, the smell of turkey and stuffing thick in the air. It should have been a normal holiday. Instead, it turned into a war zone. I sat down, placed the paperwork on the table, and slid it across to my mother. "So, Mom, want to explain this?" Silence. My aunt let out a choked gasp. My uncle turned away. My grandfather, who was normally a quiet, steady man, smashed his glass against the wall so hard it shattered. "You should have burned that test," he roared, his face red with fury. My mother burst into tears. "I never wanted you to know," she whispered, her voice shaking. I sat there, my hands clenched into fists, my heart pounding in my ears. "Who is he?" My voice came out flat, empty. I didn't feel real. "Who is my real father?" She didn't answer right away. My aunt was sobbing. My uncle still refused to look at me. My grandfather was shaking with rage. And then, finally, she spoke. "He was a mistake," she said, barely above a whisper. "A mistake I tried to forget. I had spent my whole life believing my father was a great man. A man I lost too soon. But now, I wasn't even sure if he ever was my father. And judging by the way my grandfather reacted, I had a feeling this secret ran deep." Thanksgiving dinner turned into a war zone. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. My mother's face was pale, her hands shaking as she clutched the DNA results like they might disappear if she held them tight enough. My grandfather was breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. My aunt had her hand over her mouth like she was trying to hold in a scream. I swallowed hard. "Who is he?" I asked again, my voice colder this time. Who is my real father? My mother opened her mouth, but no words came out. I saw the hesitation in her eyes, the way she looked at my grandfather like she was waiting for permission to speak. And that was when I knew. This wasn't just some one-time mistake. This was something bigger. You've been lying to me my whole life, I said, my voice rising. All of you. My eyes darted around the table. Nobody would look at me. You all knew, didn't you? My uncle finally spoke, his voice low and tense. You don't understand, kid. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I don't understand. Please, enlighten me. My mother let out a shaky breath. It's not what you think, she started, but I cut her off. It's exactly what I think. My hands were trembling. My whole life, you told me I was Dad's son. That he loved me. That I had his eyes, his heart. I pointed at the paper. But according to this, my real father is some guy I've never even heard of. So which part was the lie? The part where you said Dad loved me? Or the part where you pretended he was even my father at all? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I was too angry to care. I deserve to know the truth, I said through clenched teeth. My grandfather slammed his hand down on the table so hard the dishes rattled. No, you don't. My head snapped toward him. Excuse me? He leaned forward, his face red with anger. Some secrets should stay buried. I scoffed. Buried? You mean like my real father? Where is he? Is he dead? Is that why you kept this from me? That was when my mother finally broke. No, she whispered, shaking her head. He's alive. My stomach twisted. He's alive, I repeated. My voice sounded hollow. She nodded. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My real father wasn't dead. He was out there, somewhere, living his life. A man I never knew existed. My mother wiped at her tears, her hands still trembling. I was going to tell you, she whispered. One day. When? I snapped. When I was on my deathbed? When I had grandkids of my own? When, Mom? She didn't answer. I turned to my grandfather. And you? Why are you so damn mad? What are you hiding? He glared at me but didn't speak. And then my uncle muttered, because if you go digging, you won't like what you find. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell does that mean? I demanded. My uncle exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. Your real father, he wasn't just some guy. My mother shot him a warning look, but he ignored her. He was dangerous. Dangerous. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. My hands felt ice cold. What are you saying? My uncle hesitated, then sighed. He wasn't just some fling. He wasn't some old boyfriend. Your mother, she didn't leave him because she wanted to. She left him because she had to. I stared at my mother. Is that true? She looked away. Something inside me cracked. My whole life, I had imagined my father as this perfect man. And now, I was being told that my real father was someone my mother had run from. Why? My voice was barely above a whisper. My mother's hands clenched in her lap. Because, she said slowly, if he knew you existed, he would have come for you. A cold, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't just a family secret. This was something worse. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the truth after all. A truth worse than I expected. The room felt suffocating. My mother wouldn't look at me. My grandfather was seething, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. My uncle looked like he regretted saying anything at all. My aunt had tears in her eyes, but she wouldn't speak. I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat. My real father wasn't just some random man. He was dangerous. And my mother had been running from him. My breath came fast and shallow. Why? I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. Why would he come for me? My mother squeezed her eyes shut, like she could wish herself away from this conversation. My grandfather was the one who answered. Because you're his son. His voice was rough, filled with something I couldn't quite place, anger? Fear? I let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, I got that part. I gestured to the paperwork. Biology is pretty straightforward. My uncle shook his head. No. You don't get it. He leaned forward, lowering his voice like someone else might be listening. That man, your real father, was not the kind of person who let things go. A cold chill ran down my spine. What did he do? I asked. Nobody answered right away. My mother wiped at her eyes, and my grandfather exhaled sharply like he was debating whether to even tell me. Then, my uncle spoke again. He was a criminal, he said, his voice flat. And not the small-time kind. Not the kind who just scams people or sells stolen cars. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. He was involved in things you don't want to know about, my uncle continued. Drugs, money laundering, extortion. And worse. The room was spinning. Worse? My voice cracked. My grandfather slammed his palm down on the table. That's enough. His face was red with anger. You don't need to tell him everything. I snapped my head toward him. Yes. I do. My uncle looked at my mother again, like he was asking permission. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. And that's when he dropped the real bombshell. He wasn't just dangerous, my uncle said. He was connected. My throat went dry. Connected? I echoed. My mother swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father was involved with the mafia. I stared at her. The mafia. I almost laughed. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad movie. But the way my family was acting, this wasn't a joke. This has to be a mistake, I said. This can't be real. But my mother's face was dead serious. We had to run, she whispered. I had to disappear. If he knew about you, he never would have let me leave. My stomach twisted into knots. I had spent my whole life mourning a father I never knew. Wishing I had more than just old photos and stories. And now, I was being told that my real father wasn't just some absent man, he was a monster. I felt sick. How did you get away? I asked. My voice sounded hollow. My mother swallowed hard. We had help. That set my grandfather off. We shouldn't be talking about this. He turned to my mother. You promised this would never come out. I felt my hands shaking. Who helped you? Silence. Then, my mother exhaled slowly. The FBI. I nearly fell out of my chair. The FBI? I was part of a case, she said, her voice shaky. They were investigating him. I didn't know at first, but when I found out, I cooperated. I gave them information. And in exchange, they helped me disappear. Everything felt unreal. I had heard of witness protection before. But this? My own mother? My entire life had been built on a lie, because it had to be. I stared at her. You were in witness protection? She nodded. I couldn't speak. It all made sense now. The way my grandfather had reacted. The reason nobody wanted to talk. The reason my family had been so desperate to keep this a secret. But then, a terrifying thought crept into my mind. If she was in witness protection, that meant my father had been caught. Right? I swallowed hard. What happened to him? My mother hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. He went to prison. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Good. But then, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. I didn't like it. What? I asked. She looked down at her hands. He got out. Every muscle in my body locked up. What? I choked. He was sentenced to life, she said quickly. But, things change. Deals are made. Corruption exists. And a few years ago, he was released. My vision blurred. He's out there? My voice rose. She nodded, her hands gripping the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. And that's when the final, horrible realization hit me. I had taken a DNA test. A test that connected me to my biological relatives. A test that could lead him straight to me. A secret exposed, and a man who won't stay gone. I felt like I was drowning. My mother's words echoed in my skull, he got out. He's out there. My real father, the man I had never known, the man she had spent her life running from, was free. And worse? I had just sent my DNA out into the world. I had put a giant, blinking target on my back. If he had any reason to look for me, now he had one. The thought made me sick. I shot to my feet so fast my chair nearly toppled over. You should have told me, I spat. You should have told me. My mother was crying now. I wanted to protect you. By lying to me? By letting me grow up thinking I was someone I'm not? My voice was shaking. Do you even realize what you've done? My grandfather slammed his hand on the table again, rattling the plates. Enough. I turned to him, my hands curled into fists. No. Not enough. You all sat here and let me believe a lie for years. You told me stories about a man who was never my father. You smiled in my face, acting like you weren't hiding something this massive. And now? Now, because of you, he might know exactly where to find me. My mother winced. We don't know that. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, don't we? I grabbed my phone off the table, opened the Ancestry site, and pulled up the DNA Relatives tab. My hands trembled as I scrolled, my heart pounding harder with each name. And then I saw it. A new connection. A match labeled parent. My blood turned to ice. My breath hitched. Oh my God, I whispered. The name wasn't familiar to me. It wasn't the one I had seen before. But the connection was unmistakable. I turned my phone toward my mother. Is this him? My voice was barely above a whisper. She paled instantly. My grandfather cursed under his breath. My aunt gasped. And that was all the confirmation I needed. He found me, I murmured. My stomach twisted. He's already looking. Nobody spoke. For a long time, the only sound in the room was my mother's quiet sobs. Then, the front door rattled. We all froze. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the house. Knock. 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 My grandfather shot to his feet. My uncle reached for something in his jacket, something I was almost sure was a gun. My mother looked like she was about to be sick. The knock came again. My chest tightened. My skin felt too tight. I stepped toward the door. Don't, my mother pleaded, her voice thick with panic. Please, don't open it. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know. I reached for the handle, my breath coming fast and shallow. Then, I pulled the door open. And I came face to face with the man who had haunted my mother's past. He was older now, but there was no mistaking it, he had my face. My eyes. My jawline. And he was smiling. Hello, son. His voice was smooth, calm, like this was a normal conversation. It's been a long time. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. My mother let out a strangled sob behind me. I stared at him, my throat dry. What do you want? He tilted his head slightly, his smile never fading. Is that any way to greet your father? You're not my father, I snapped. His eyes darkened. Behind me, my grandfather stepped forward. You need to leave. His voice was low, dangerous. My real father chuckled. Oh, come on now. Is that any way to treat family? He looked at me again, ignoring everyone else. I see you got my message. He nodded toward my phone. I was wondering when you'd finally learn the truth. I tightened my grip on the doorframe. Why are you here? He sighed, shaking his head. You've been kept from me for a long time, son. And I think it's about time we fixed that. My mother sobbed. You're not taking him. My father's gaze flickered to her, and his smile turned sharp. You don't get to decide that anymore. Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I don't know what you think is going to happen here, I said, my voice steady. But I'm not going anywhere with you. I don't owe you anything. His jaw twitched. I could feel my grandfather tense behind me, my uncle shifting slightly, ready for something, anything. But then my father's expression shifted, his smile returning like it had never left. Of course, he said smoothly. I wouldn't want to force you. My gut told me he was lying. But, he continued, his voice casual, I think you should hear me out before you make any decisions. He stepped back, putting his hands in his pockets. You've been told a lot of stories about me, haven't you? I didn't answer. He smirked. Did they tell you I was a monster? That I was some kind of evil man? He chuckled. They always were good at spinning tales. My mother's breath hitched. I don't know what's true, I admitted. But I know you weren't in my life. And that was for a reason. He sighed dramatically. Oh, kid. There's so much you don't know. He looked at my mother again, his expression unreadable. Maybe one day, you'll be ready to hear my side of the story. Then, just like that, he turned on his heel and walked away. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. But as he disappeared into the night, a pit formed in my stomach. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. My mother sat at the table, her hands shaking. My grandfather looked furious, but there was something else in his eyes, fear. My uncle just rubbed his face, muttering curses under his breath. I sat down, my head spinning. Everything had changed. My past. My identity. My very existence. I had spent my whole life thinking I knew who I was. But now? Now I wasn't sure of anything. The worst part? I wasn't sure I'd ever get the full truth. Because if there was one thing I had learned tonight, it was this: every person in this family had their own secrets. And some of them would stay buried forever.